Shabbat Shalom, CBST. It is an honor to join you all this evening for your MLK Day Shabbat. As one of the first openly gay Black members of Congress, it means so much to be welcome here. I was raised in the Baptist church, where things have gotten better, but it's still taboo to be gay. As a kid struggling with self-acceptance and afraid of how others would perceive me if they learned the truth, life would have been much easier had I been able to see people like me welcome in more communal spaces, especially religious ones. It would have given me hope that everything would be one day okay, that I didn't have to hide or cry so much, and that one day society would judge me based on the content of my character rather than who I loved. Since my childhood, things have gotten better, not because time passed, but because countless LGBTQ plus advocates made life better. Because people like you created communities like this, and then leveraged the strength of your communities to transform our society. As a Black American, I feel a particular kinship with my Jewish neighbors. It is my honor to represent diverse and dynamic Jewish communities across Rockland and Westchester counties in New York's 17th Congressional District. Our communities have a long-standing partnership in the fight for social justice. As Dr. King once said to the American Jewish Congress, our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries, not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make oppression of any people by others an impossibility. This week's Torah portion meant a lot to Dr. King. It tells of how the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea from bondage into freedom. In a 1956 sermon, Dr. King observed, "This story, at bottom, symbolizes the death of inhuman oppression and ungodly exploitation. The departure from the Egypt of segregation to the land of the beloved community. It teaches us," he said, "to hope, to have faith that generation after generation, the forces of freedom and justice shall emerge victoriously out of some Red Sea, if we answer the sacred call to risk the crossing." This week, I have been reflecting on how 56 years ago, 600 peaceful protesters prepared to risk their own crossing from bondage into freedom by marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. On the other side stood Sheriff Jim Clark and his armed patrolmen, ready to stop them. Those protesters marched on. Troopers put on their gas masks and gassed the marchers, brutally beating them with billy clubs and cattle prods. Some of Clark's men mounted their horses and charged, pursuing the protesters like the Pharaoh's chariots pursuing the Israelites, while unleashing the rebel yell. They beat John Lewis so hard that they broke his skull. They hospitalized dozens of people. But 2 days later, joined by Diane Nash and Dr. King, those protesters marched on. And 5 months after Bloody Sunday, Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act. As we remember the crossings our people have made in the past, let us also recognize the crossing we must undertake together today. The crossing from an ailing democracy that is increasingly in crisis, to the true multiracial democracy we had not had until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which the Supreme Court gutted in a 2013 decision called Shelby County v. Holder, and which Congress is now trying to restore. Let us also recognize who stands in our way. A couple of senators who would let white nationalists break the skull of our democracy rather than revise even one of the Senate's rules. You see, we stand at a crossroads. We have reached what may be our last chance to rescue this nation from radical, far-right, racist minority rule. Our nation and our world can ill afford to allow QAnon conspiracy theorists and fascists who refuse to certify election results to disenfranchise their way back into power. If the Senate does not act, the road before us is one where democracy dies in darkness. That is why, from the start of this Congress, we have had a plan to rescue and revitalize our democracy. First, craft comprehensive democracy legislation that can unite Democratic majorities in the House and in the Senate in the face of unanimous Republican opposition. Second, abolish or reform the filibuster so that we can keep our promise to protect our democracy without compromising with the very people who threaten it. And third, deliver the bill to President Biden's desk in time to enact this democracy-saving legislation before it's too late. With yesterday's passage of the Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act in the House, we have signaled as clearly as ever that we are done with the first phase. Democrats stand united behind transformative democracy legislation that can meet this moment. Senator Manchin himself is a proud champion of this bill, and Senator Sinema endorsed its content on the Senate floor. This bill includes many of the most important provisions of two democracy bills the House passed last year: the For the People Act, also known as H.R. 1, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, while adding new ones to address the surging threat of election subversion. Now, like the For the People Act, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act would establish automatic and same-day voter registration, adding upwards of 50 million new voters to the polls. It would ban partisan gerrymandering in every state, preventing QAnon conspiracy theorists and fascists from coasting to victory in general election contests simply because they've prevailed in their primaries. It would bring dark money into the light with new disclosure requirements. And it would empower states to amplify the voices of small donors by funding small donor public matching programs in every state that wants one. Like the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, this bill would also restore preclearance, the foundation of the Voting Rights Act, demolished by the Supreme Court in the Shelby decision. I am especially proud to have made major contributions to this legislation. The Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act contains my Right to Vote Act, the first affirmative guarantee of the right to vote in our nation's history. For the first time, federal courts will be required to treat the right to vote as the fundamental right that it is. That means that no government, state, local, or federal, could make it harder to vote without proving that doing so is the least restrictive way to protect our elections. And no longer can the far right use the big lie to justify racist voter suppression. The legislation we passed in the House yesterday also includes key provisions of my Inclusive Elections Act. Under these provisions, a voter suppression law will be illegal if it disparately burdens people of color or linguistic minorities, and that disparity is connected to discriminatory conditions. These provisions would restore the protections of another part of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court gutted last year in a decision called Brnovich v. DNC. The Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act will be transformative if the Senate passes it. So now we find ourselves in phase two, abolishing, or at the very least, narrowing the filibuster. The Senate will debate this legislation, preparing for a final vote on Tuesday, following Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The Senate, of course, could pass the bill tomorrow. But two Democratic senators are standing in our way by joining Republicans in their opposition. These two Democratic senators cling to the delusion that 10 Republicans will join them in the fight for democracy, even as Republicans drag our democracy further into crisis. They believe that the filibuster is more important to our democracy than the right to vote itself, and that they do not desist from that delusion, they will kill this bill. Make no mistake, the violence the filibuster inflicts may be less visible than the Pharaoh's chariots or the billy clubs of Jim Clark's men, but it is no less real. Right now, it is the filibuster that allows right-wing radicals to suppress the vote and subvert our elections. It is the filibuster that prevents us from passing the PRO Act and empowering workers across the country. It is the filibuster that prevents us from passing the Equality Act and finally outlawing discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community once and for all. If we are to save our democracy, there is no alternative to abolishing or reforming the filibuster and passing this democracy bill. We can't just out-organize partisan gerrymanders. We can't just outvote a party that is committed to overturning the results when they are outvoted. And we had better not ask Black and brown voters to do twice as much to save our democracy when some in Washington cannot be bothered to do half as much as they should. We must pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, and we must do that now. This weekend, as we answer the call to cross over to democracy once again, let us hope that two senators do not stand in our way. As Dr. King urged in his preaching on this week's Torah portion, let us not despair. Let us believe that a prejudiced mind, or perhaps in the Senate's case, multiple prejudiced minds, can be changed, and that humanity, by the grace of God, can be lifted from the valley of hate to the high mountain of love. Let us hope, and more than that, let us do the work together. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.